All right. So, okay. I'm gonna do this kind of two-handed thing. So I think picking up nicely here on the theme that Valerie ended on, and also some of the themes we've seen in the other talks. So the opening idea of the problem with the word diversity, actually, is where I want to begin, and then I'll try to point out the other connections as they come through. So, bridges and barriers, engaging the privileged in this problem or diversity efforts. So kind of general literature review, I'll keep it short. We know, people in this room know, and are the ones who have researched for decades now, that there is a diversity problem. And what we mean by that is really an equity problem. There are pay gaps, leadership gaps, employment gaps, full-blown discrimination, harassment, all sorts of issues preventing women, racial minorities, lower social class, other stigmatized groups from advancing in our organizations. And organizations, at least seemingly, are starting to care about this, and they come up with remedies, so with programs. So for instance, Lean In. Lean In, great program. It's really focusing on helping women lean into that table, to overcome the disadvantages that they may face, to empower them. It's really focused on them as a disadvantaged group. What I would like to suggest, and again connecting to the idea of diversity as a problem word maybe, is that this is a diversity-focused approach, which is really a disadvantage-focused approach. And while the disadvantaged groups perhaps historically have not been focused on enough, that's only going to solve half the problem if we only think about the lack of equity as a disadvantage issue, and we don't think about the advantage or the privileged side. So, along with Lean In, a great program, why don't we also have something that looks more like Move Over? So, you might guess some reasons why we probably don't have a problem like this, but the metaphor is really key, right? So just as I'm asking women to lean into this table, if the men are crowding it, well, they could help me too by just scooching a bit, right? And so how can we engage the men in this case, more generally the advantaged, the privileged group members, in these efforts to create more equity? Some of the giggles, I'm sure, were because this just doesn't feel very palatable. Like, yeah, right? How are we going to get men to just move over just because we told them to? And so that's what I'm going to really explore today is what are the privileged sort of first initial responses to the idea that they even have privilege or have advantage at all? And then once we understand some of those first reactions, does that give us some sort of tools that we can use to bring them on board and engage them in these efforts with the rest of us? All right. So the couple of questions for this talk. How do the privileged respond to evidence of privilege first? And then again, how do these responses affect their support for various equity and diversity initiatives? So a series of experiments. I'm going to go through them relatively quickly because they're kind of simple, but you'll see the point building. First, one of the ways that the privileged respond to the idea of privilege is that they cover it. So probably everyone knows kind of classic site, the invisible knapsack. Privilege is this invisible thing, but how does it get that way? It doesn't just come inherently invisible. People make it invisible. And so what we see, well, I'll walk you through this first and then we'll kind of see. So here in this design, it's a pretty simple design. We have Stanford students go through this job hiring scenario. And at the end, they learned that it was a close call between someone from Stanford and our mortal enemy, Berkeley. And half of the people learn, but the boss would probably always pick a Stanford grad if they could help it, right? So this is a privileging process. That's an advantage. Or the disadvantage statement. But the boss probably would never pick a Berkeley grad if they could help it, right? So a more traditional understanding of disadvantage and discrimination. Both processes happen all the time in organizations, but how do people think about them? So, first result, people who read, again, it leads to the same result. The Stanford person gets hired in both cases. But people who read that the boss would always prefer that group, they don't see this as very discriminatory as compared to the people who read about someone who would never hire a Berkeley student. We also see a difference in how much, again, these are Stanford students, how much they personally believe that this Stanford name may have privileged them if they were in this job scenario. They believe that less when they've read about this kind of advantaging, privileging process as compared to when they learn about the disadvantage one. And they also are more likely to deny that this outcome was unfair. Again, if it's framed as privilege. So we see people we present them the evidence. Here's a privilege, it is happening. It's happened to you, to your colleague. And they're starting to cover it up and say, no, that's not really discrimination, that's not really privilege, that's not really unfair. Switching to a gender context, similar setup, it's close call, Jake and Melissa. Bosses always felt men fit better with the team culture. Bosses always felt women fit worse with the team culture. And here we see a similar pattern of findings, but the one that I want to point out, would Jake get the job if he were a woman? So let's imagine the counterfactual, the alternative scenario. And when it's framed as the boss thought men fit better with the culture, people are like, well, yeah, Jake would still get it if he was a woman. And what that tells us is people are attributing Jake's success to Jake, to him as a person, and not to the kind of broader structure and system that's boosting him. So another way that people cover and make invisible the privileges that are helping them. All right, so what happens if instead of this kind of scenario, we just give people evidence and we say, scientists think privilege is real, here's a ton of evidence. How do people respond to that? So here we're in the context of race now, so white adults. Half of them read this sort of elaborated prompt that's made to look like a research article. Basically, it says that most social scientists agree, even today, white Americans enjoy many privileges that black Americans do not. In the no privilege condition, they don't read this prompt, but in both cases, they just know that the study's generally about inequality, right? So everyone's thinking about inequality, kind of a common baseline, but that inequality is framed as privilege in one case, and just plain inequality in the other. Here what we see happen, and I really want to belabor this point. These are white people who were just told that they have advantages across all sorts of domains, jobs, housing, healthcare, incarceration, legal services, all sorts of things. After reading that, they respond by telling me that their lives are harder as compared to when they did not read about the relative ease of their lives, right? So another form of covering, another form of denial. Here they're saying, no, my life is hard. I see your information about privilege, that evidence, but I don't want to engage in that conversation because my life is hard. And this is what's starting to give us this, this sort of insight into maybe where we can start to create change. So if what people are really doing is they're not necessarily concerned about the status quo and protecting the structure, if what they're concerned about is their own self, that they want to feel like a good person, they want to feel like they've earned their things, then we can start to address that kind of self-focused defense and maybe get beyond it to the point where they'll start to recognize privilege. So then just to follow up here, instead of having that inequality control, it's just no information whatsoever, slightly different context back to a class privilege. So here, Stanford students again learn that they get advantages in the job market based on the name of their university alone, above and beyond any differences in skills and intelligence. And we see the same result again. So the privileged group, upon learning about privilege, denies it, covers it by saying, no, no, my individual life has actually been very hard. All right, so kind of more evidence of covering. What are maybe more creative ways that people do this? In this study, we're again focused on class privilege. So people learn the top 10% of incomes are considered wealthy. Wealthy status alone gives them all these advantages, da 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 da. The other people, of course, don't learn this. But then this time we cross it, because again, we're trying to get at that motivational element. What's really driving these responses? Is it concern for the general status quo, or is it concern for the self? So half the people learn that actually they are in the top 10%, so they're in this privileged group, and the other half of the people learn that no, that it's not actually relevant to them personally. And they get a nice little graphic to really hit home the point. All right, so now instead of hardships, we ask them, how hard do you try at your job? How much effort do you put in at work? Another version of trying to cover privilege, instead of denying that it exists, saying your life has been hard, is to deny that it's unearned by saying you've worked really hard. And so what we see is that when the privilege is self-relevant, so when people think that they're in that top 10%, that category that we've told them is the privileged group, they claim to work harder at their jobs as compared to when they didn't learn about this privilege information. But we do not see that same difference when it's not self-relevant, so when they're not part of the threatened group, when the threat's not relevant to themselves. Real quickly, a very similar setup. I won't explain this easy life, hard life, but suffice to say, in the easy life category, here, the privilege is self-relevant again, okay? People have been given evidence that maybe this applies to me. And so now, instead of just claiming job effort, they're actually putting in effort on a difficult task. So how long are they willing to spend and kind of waste their day on my really boring, very difficult puzzle task that I gave them? So it turns out, when they've been told about privilege and it's somehow self-relevant, again, just like they claimed more life hardships, they claimed to work harder at their jobs, now they're actually putting in more effort in an attempt to try, again, to cover that privilege and make it invisible. Whereas when they don't have this same motivation, when they don't think the privilege is relevant because they've actually had a hard life, which we manipulate, we don't see that pattern happen. In fact, it starts to reverse. All right, another version. Again, hitting home on this point, there's a self-motivation underlying a lot of this, rather than necessarily a kind of broader status quo motivation. And the reason I focus on that is because if it's a self-defense mechanism, that gives us an opportunity to actually do something to change it. We can address that self-defense concern and overcome it, which we'll start to look at in the next study. So here, as a last demonstration, people were again in a job scenario study. And half the people read it from the perspective of the self, so they're imagining themselves doing this job scenario, this competitive hiring. And the other half were in the perspective of someone else. So in this case, it's some random guy named Jake, which happens to be my little brother's name. I used his resume. I hope he's okay with that. But anyway, so Jake is getting a job and they're reading about him. Again, crossing this with privilege. I'm sorry, that says low merit. It should say no privilege. So in the privilege condition, people in the job scenario learn they had an inside connection to the company, a common way that we know privilege actually manifests. Their father's friend works at the company, so they're going to be flagged as an internal referral, a really key structural component or way that privilege manifests. In the no privilege condition, they instead learn that they worked really hard, they studied the company in detail, and so they're going to have a high quality flag on their application. All right, so what do we see? When it's someone else, so when it's Jake, understandably, people do not think that it took very much effort for Jake to get an internal referral flag as compared to getting a high quality flag. But when it's me instead thinking about this, all of a sudden that gap, it doesn't disappear, but it attenuates, and significantly so. So now all of a sudden, I think it took some amount of effort on my part to get an internal referral, to have my dad know someone, but it didn't really take as much effort on Jake's part, right? So I'm covering again, I'm claiming effort. And importantly, in this study, we also measure perceived outcome fairness. So it turns out, people also find the outcome to be more fair when it's your own privilege helping you out as compared to someone else. But this is created by or caused by that effort belief. So when I claim effort to cover privilege, to make it invisible, that itself has consequences. Now, all of a sudden, I also think things are more fair because, hey, I worked hard, so I guess it's fair after all. Okay, so now that we've kind of gotten inside a little bit, the heads of the privileged, how do they make things invisible? How do they respond when we try to uninvisible privilege? What's a way to overcome this? If it's about self, that gives us some clues. So first, I argue that it's really about people's concern for feeling like a good person, like they've deserved and earned their things. And if that's true, then affirming in some way their sense of merit, their sense of having earned and deserved their things, should help them overcome this initial barrier and then lead us to the ability to bridge, to help involve the privileged in the diversity effort, or at least in the recognition that privilege exists. So again, privilege, no privilege, manipulated, so half the people read about privilege that's self-relevant, the other half do not. Then we cross that with half the people also get a chance to write about a time that they've achieved something that they did by themselves or on their own. It can just be anything, just something you did on your own. And the other condition, low merit, something they achieved with outside help or with assistance. Now what's key here is that this is also a good thing. They've still achieved something. It's just in some sort of team or group context. They've had some help, they did it as a team. Usually people write about sports achievements. But what's key is that if it's really a self-concern, then only the high merit condition should alleviate people's concerns. It's only when I can prove that I did something on my own that I can then feel better about the idea of privilege having also helped me out. All right, so in the low merit condition, again, we see that same pattern we've seen a few times now, that when people who have privilege are told about that privilege, they claim that their lives are harder as compared to when they did not hear about that privilege. But key is that when they first get a chance to sort of disarm and say, okay, yes, I've also tried hard in my life, now all of a sudden they're more willing to recognize that maybe that privilege had an effect and they're not claiming as hard of a life anymore. So they're not kind of engaging in this covering process quite as much. All right, so the last study, back in the context of race this time. So again, people read about white privilege or not. All of the participants are white. And this time, instead of using this kind of merit affirmation, we use an actual affirmation. So many of you will know what that is. For those who don't, a self-affirmation is sort of a classic psychological task now. So half of the people rank and then write about the value that's most important to them individually. And the other half of people do not engage in this task. And this happens before they either learn about privilege or not. And so the general idea here is that if they are not given a chance to first affirm, and thus get rid of some of this self-defensive motivation, then evidence of racial privilege will make whites claim that their lives are harder, again, in this kind of covering, minimizing effort. But if first they get a chance to use an affirmation to kind of focus themselves on another aspect of their lives that's important, now all of a sudden they're more willing to engage in the information that we're giving them. They're more willing to listen, they're more open to it, and so they should not be claiming as hard of a life anymore. And that's generally what we find. So same pattern again, without an affirmation, we again see white people who are told that whites have privilege say instead, no, my life has been really hard. So they're denying this idea of privilege. But when they're first engaging in the self-affirmation, we see this start to reverse. So now, white people who are told about white privilege not only are not claiming that their lives are as hard, but they're actually claiming their lives are relatively less hard, right? So the difference between these bars here. Belief in personal privilege. Again, in the no affirmation condition, so when they're not given a chance to get rid of this self-defensive motivation, white people are less willing to believe that they personally have benefited from being white. But when we give them the chance to affirm, now we see it start to go in the other direction. So now white people, given evidence of white privilege, are more willing to start to believe that it affects them personally, that they personally may have benefited from being white. And that's a really key variable for me, as we'll see in this giant model. So this is a structural equation model. I'm happy to talk with individuals more about it later, but I'm just going to walk through it sort of simply. So in the no affirmation condition, what we see is that white people who learn about white privilege are more likely to claim life hardships. This claiming of hardships, this sort of covering self-defensive mechanism, leads them to believe less that they personally have benefited from privilege, and therefore, because it's negative, less likely to support affirmative action, which is something that could start to fix part of the problem of privilege. But when people affirm themselves first, so when this self-defensive issue is taken care of, now all of a sudden reading about privilege makes them somewhat less likely to believe their lives have been hard, and thus more likely to recognize they personally have benefited and more likely to start to support affirmative action. And what's really key here, what I want to note, is that these yellow numbers, those are the only ones that significantly change between the two conditions. And so what that means is the affirmation at the beginning and the information about privilege, it's not necessarily affecting directly how people feel about affirmative action or even how people feel about personal privilege, like how much it affects them personally. But rather, it's affecting that initial defensive mechanism, which makes it really key for overcoming if we want to create change on down the line. So in conclusion, I would just like to say, when we're thinking about this problem word, diversity, we've heard a few people note today, I think Bill talked about the interlocking. Ooh, I hit it too. The interlocking, that men and women are in this together. We heard Aida talk about, it's the people in power, the people who are the deciders, so to speak. How exactly do we engage them? So the first step is, I would like to argue, we should engage them. They're really key to engage in this process of change. And then also that we need to be aware of the particular concerns they may have during that engagement so we can make it successful. We need to be especially sensitive to the idea that they might be self-defensive at first, but if we can break through that in the way that we frame things, the way we approach the relationship, then we can actually get them to start to play ball. And with that, you get a better situation overall. So for example, you'd be an asset to this company and an employee referral bonus to me. We know that internal referrals are a major source of disadvantage as well as privilege. But it's the people who are in the company who get to decide whether or not to continue this policy. So these are the people we have to engage. Similarly, Peter Thiel, this has been really big in Silicon Valley, but he recommends that when you're starting your unicorn startup, that you hire your 5 best friends, because that's what makes a company work best. We know that's a huge privileging process that's really bad for diversity, but they don't necessarily know that. They don't think of this as privilege. They cover it, it's invisible. So instead, if we uncloak it, and we do this in a way that looks out for self-defensive traps, then we might actually engage these people in change. Thank you.